Hello, everybody. My name is Leah Gage, and I am VegFund's Program Officer. And I am so excited today to introduce our very first Ask Me Anything session. And we're so thrilled to have Dr. Melanie Joy with us today. So before we talk about that, again, there's me. My name's Leah. I'm the Program Officer at VegFund. And for those of you who don't know VegFund, we are an organization that provides grants to thousands of activists all over the world. We provide grants for community outreach events like food samplings, paid per view, street outreach, film screenings. We've also branched off into funding more robust learning tools and panel discussions. If you have a pamphlet or a guide on maybe climate change and veganism, something like that. Those are things that we would fund, as well as kind of our catch-all category, innovative outreach, for things that don't quite fit into some of our grant categories. So for those of you who are already VegFund activists, who already receive grant funds, we are so excited that you're here. And for those of you who are hearing about this for the first time, or maybe have heard of us but never applied, we'd really encourage you to take a look. Obviously, the new realities right now mean we can't do food sampling and veg fests and all that in the same way. But we've definitely had a lot of activists be really creative in this weird pandemic time. So we'd encourage you to do the same and take a look at vegfund.org or to go to our application/apply. If you're not ready to apply for a grant, no problem. We have a ton of resources on our website. Our blog is a really popular resource, and we have a great blog up right now on how to be a vegan activist during a world crisis, with tons of ideas for things that you can do that aren't the typical street, in-person outreach that we're all used to, as well as lots of activist stories about the work that we do and the work that our grantees do, and other webinars and other things that we have on our site. So definitely check those out. During today's AMA session, you can ask questions by adding a comment on the Facebook Live video, or you can go via Messenger at facebook.com/vegfund. Hopefully you're there right now. If you're going to post about it or tweet about it, please use our hashtag VegFundAMA. This is our first AMA, and so we really want people to see it. And then any platform, Instagram, YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, you name it, it's at VegFund to tag us. So we hope you'll do that. And without further ado, I think those are the last things that I have. So I'm going to stop my share. And we have a brief video before we introduce Dr. Melanie Joy. So I will say Melanie Joy, for those of you who don't know her, she is a psychologist. She is an author and organizational consultant, relationship coach, and of course, an animal advocate. And she's written several books, including the most recent book, Getting Relationships Right. And that's all about relational literacy, which is what we're going to talk about today. So before we get started with the AMA, let's watch a quick video to kind of introduce the concept of relational literacy.
Some of the greatest joys in your life, and also some of your deepest sorrows and frustrations. Chances are they all have to do with relationships. Finding your life partner, being toasted by your colleagues for an important achievement, the death of a dear friend, or perhaps of a beloved pet, the family member whose politics offend you, or the neighbor who refuses to turn down their music. Now consider how, even though most of us have to learn complicated geometry that we'll probably never need to use, we don't get a single lesson in how to have healthy relationships. And when you think of some of the most pressing problems, not only in our lives, but also in our world, such as war, sexism, racism, poverty, political polarization, epidemic, toxic communication, animal exploitation, climate change, these are not problems that are caused by the fact that people can't do geometry. It's easy to feel overwhelmed and to despair when we think of all of these problems as completely separate and distinct, as having to be resolved one at a time. But all these problems share a common denominator: relational dysfunction, or problematic ways of relating. Relational literacy is the understanding of and ability to practice healthy ways of relating. And the good news is that anyone who wants to develop relational literacy can, with awareness and the right tools. All of my work focuses in one way or another on transforming relationships with other individuals, with the broader communities and systems that we're a part of, including those that involve animals, and even with ourselves. Most of us communicate with ourselves in a way we never tolerate coming from someone else. My work is designed to build relational literacy through raising awareness of the often invisible obstacles, such as counterproductive ways of thinking and harmful social systems, that prevent us from practicing our integrity and fulfilling our natural drive to connect. My work also helps build relational literacy through providing practical tools for transformation. When we develop relational literacy, we can deepen virtually all of our connections, even with those whose opinions are radically different from ours. And we automatically become a part of the solution, helping to create a kinder and healthier world for everyone.
Great. Thank you so much for sharing that, Fabiola. And welcome, Dr. Melanie Joy.
Hi. Hi. Thank you so much for having me. It's good to see you, Leah, and good to be here.
Good. It's so good to see you. Thank you so much for doing this.
It's a pleasure.
This is a bit of an experiment, so thank you so much for being our first AMA.
Yeah, I'm really looking forward to it.
Great. So we're getting some questions here I'm seeing, but I thought I'd just start off by asking you, in your book, you talk a lot about empathy and the need for us to really exercise empathy and to take the temperature of our empathy. And since that's so relevant now, you know, as this is a polarizing time, but also as vegan activists, I wonder if you could talk a little bit about empathy and how necessary that is to relational literacy.
Absolutely. A lot of people who become vegan are also people who tend to be high in empathy, really more sensitive and more empathic than the average person. And this isn't true for all vegans, but very often those of us who are attracted to this work empathize more strongly with others. And so really practicing our empathy, or practicing healthy empathy, means two things. It means being able to stay connected with our empathy when we're dealing with differences that may cause us to feel angry, or not just angry, but differences that may cause us to feel judgmental of others and cause disconnection between ourselves and others. It also means recognizing when we may be over empathizing with others, because empathy is not always, or having a lot of empathy is not always going to serve us. So people who tend to be high on empathy are people who tend to look at the world through the eyes of others very easily. And if we do that a lot, we can lose sight of what we actually authentically think and feel. And we can end up being in positions where we're mistreated and we don't necessarily stand up for ourselves. We can be, for example, on the receiving end of carnistic hostility, being teased or mocked by non-vegans and not feeling like we can stand up for ourselves. Anger, sometimes when we're really high in empathy, we struggle to connect with our anger. We can be people who say, oh my God, it just takes so much to get me angry. A lot of women struggle with this. I cry easily, but I don't get angry. And anger is, of course, important for us to be able to feel. Anger is the healthful, appropriate, legitimate response to injustice. Anger means that your moral compass is functioning, and it gives you the sense of empowerment to stand up against injustice. Anger becomes problematic when it is not recognized for what it is, which is simply an emotion. When we don't see our anger as an emotion, but we end up becoming hijacked by it and looking at the world through the eyes of the anger, then it becomes problematic. And our anger becomes problematic when it has the charge of contempt. And this is an issue that many vegans tend to struggle with. Contempt is a sign that we've placed ourselves in a position of moral superiority and we're looking down on others. And when you're in a place of contempt, this is profoundly disconnecting for you with other people, with others. When you're in a place of contempt, the antidote to contempt is empathy. So when you feel contempt, that's a red flag that you've lost connection with your empathy.
Yeah. And so related to that, we have a question. I think a lot of that contempt can sometimes manifest as shame or shaming others. So somebody asked, can you share some top tips to stop shaming behavior of non-vegans or fellow vegans that may not practice the way we think veganism should be practiced? And how can we catch ourselves from shaming and respond when we see someone shaming others?
So it's such a great question. And you're absolutely right. Contempt and shame are two sides of a coin. They're two emotions that are, not only are they profoundly disconnecting, but these are two emotions that exist only in relationship, only in comparison. So contempt, as I said, is a sign that we've placed ourselves in a position of moral superiority. Shame is a sign that we are feeling ourselves in a position of moral inferiority. In other words, when we feel shame, we feel less than. We don't just feel less than, we feel less worthy than others. So shame is the feeling of having less intrinsic or fundamental worth as a being. Contempt and shame are both illusions. I mean, they're real emotions, but they exist because of an illusory perception that we have, that there is some sort of a hierarchy of moral worth, that some individuals are born with more inherent or intrinsic worth than others. Or if we're not born, some people believe that we're all born in equal worth, but we lose it or we squander it when we do bad things, so to speak. So really, this is a great question. How can we prevent ourselves from shaming others? Well, the first step is to recognize in yourself if you're feeling contempt. If you're feeling that charge of looking down on somebody as somehow as being less than, of being inferior, of not deserving the same respect that you would want to be treated with. So the first step is noticing your attitude and your own feelings. The next step, the antidote to both contempt and shame is the same, and that is empathy. Both of these emotions are a sign that we have lost connection with our empathy. Shame is when we've lost connection with our empathy for ourselves. We can shame ourselves, when we compare ourselves to an idealized image of ourselves. For example, we can feel contempt for ourselves and shame ourselves as well. So shame is a sign that you've lost connection with your empathy for yourself. Contempt is a sign that you have lost connection with your empathy for somebody else. And as soon as you start feeling contempt or notice that you're feeling contempt, pause and ask yourself what you imagine the world looks like through that other person's eyes. Try to remember that each of us is nothing more nor less than two factors, essentially. The hard wiring that we've been born with, how we came down into this world biologically, and every single experience we've ever had in our lives. The intersection of these two realities is what shape us into who we are. So it's just important to stay aware of this, and also to stay aware of the fact that feeling contempt for others is almost addictive. We live in a planet that is so relationally dysfunctional, and that feeds this part of ourselves that thrives on superiority, a sense of moral superiority. We've learned that the way that we feel better about ourselves, the way that we feel that we have more power, is to find others who have less than we have. And this is a dysfunction we've been born into. So becoming aware of the reality that contempt is normal, and that it's also problematic, and that the antidote is empathy, can go a really long way to help us reduce the shaming behaviors we might engage in.
So we have a question about being in a relationship where one of us is vegan and one of us is not, maybe mostly vegan, and they make common compromises, but But if you can talk about what works best on both partners' sides and offer how people can make this work as vegan and non-vegan partners.
Yeah, well, very often we assume that problems in relationships are the result of differences. And more often than not, the differences themselves are not the problems. The differences, it's how we relate to the differences that creates problems. So all relationships, are based on the same essential principles, right? Healthy relationships are relationships in which we feel secure and connected with others. The sort of blueprint for practicing healthy relationality, whether we're interacting with the cashier at the grocery store, whether we're interacting with our life partner or with our dog, it's the same. And this is the practice of integrity, meaning practicing the value of compassion, caring for the other, and justice, being fair to the other person and also towards yourself. So this is the practice of integrity, practicing compassion and justice in your interactions toward the other person and also toward yourself, obviously to the best of your ability. In other words, pausing and saying, does this behavior, what I'm saying now, what I'm not saying now, the choice that I'm about to make, does this reflect the way that I would want to be treated? Does this reflect respect? And when we do that, we honor the dignity of the other. When you honor somebody's dignity, you're not perceiving them as less than, you're perceiving them as equally fundamentally worthy. It's kind of what I was talking about before. You're not feeling contempt and you're not shaming. So when we practice integrity and we honor dignity, what we do is we increase the sense of security and connection in our relationships. And this is really key because whether we're vegan and the other person is not vegan, whether we're atheist and the other person is Christian, whatever the difference may be, is much less important than how secure and connected our relationship is in the first place. If we are practicing the principles and tools to create a healthy relationship, a relationship that is resilient, then we know how to talk about our differences and we know how to make choices that honor each person's basic needs in the relationship. So that's kind of a big question. I mean, a broad answer to a specific question, which is, you could be very compatible people, but if you, and both be vegan, for example, but if you don't actually know how to practice healthy relationality, it won't matter how compatible you are. You'll find something to fight about. And you won't be kind to each other. In my book, Beyond Beliefs, which is a guide to improving relationships and communication for vegans, vegetarians, and meat eaters, I have a whole bunch of tools, and we can talk about those today, some of those today. But I also have scripts, the appendices that people can just photocopy and give to the non-vegans in their lives. And, and say, read this, and this will help you hopefully understand me and how it is for me to be vegan. One thing that people can do right now, vegan people can do right now, is to ask the non-vegans in their life, not to go vegan, because as we know, asking people to go vegan who are close to us often doesn't work. And relationships are not really a forum for advocacy. It's understandable that we want people to go vegan because that will make things easier in some ways, but it won't resolve any of the deeper problems that might be there. But what we can ask them to do is to be what I call a vegan ally. A vegan ally is somebody who's not vegan themselves, but who is a supporter of the vegan in their life and ultimately of veganism. So what you can say to the non-vegan in your life is, look, I would really love to share information about veganism with you, not to turn you vegan, but so you know what the world looks like through my eyes, so you understand me. Because being vegan is so fundamental, it's such an important part of my life, that if you don't understand this, you really don't understand who I am on a really important level. And we will continue to clash. And you'll do things inadvertently that will probably hurt and offend me and make it really hard for me to feel connected with you. Many vegans find that just by having the people in their lives get veganism and say, I get it, I'm not doing it myself for whatever reason right now, I'm trying, but but I respect you for your veganism and I support you. Many vegans find that that's actually enough for them to feel really secure and connected with non-vegans in that area.
Interesting. Yeah. Yeah. So we have this question, which pivots a little. Why are people so adamantly against hearing information about what is on their plate in relation to how it's affecting our planet and the current pandemic, especially? Do you have any insights?
Yeah, well, I mean, I don't think that, well, I mean, the current pandemic does play a role, but I mean, there are a couple of things that I would say to this, three things that I would say to this. One is that because of carnism, which is my earlier work looked at the psychology of eating animals, and I identified what I call carnism, the invisible belief system that conditions people to eat certain animals. Carnism shapes people's perceptions and causes an automatic defensiveness against hearing any information that challenges what they feel is their right to eat animals. So there's this automatic built-in defensiveness right there in the vast majority of people. So you could be a great communicator and you will still find that there's this wall that tends to come up as soon as you start talking about eating animals. And I think a lot of vegans can relate to this. So this is one reason it's really, really important for vegans, not only non-vegans, but especially vegans actually, to understand carnism so they understand the psychology that they're dealing with. In Beyond Beliefs, in my book, I actually have a chapter about carnism. It's a summary of carnism. And specifically, I talk about how carnism impacts relationships when one vegan is present and how it basically hijacks the non-vegan's perceptions and makes them shut the vegan, shut down information that the vegan is sharing. So that's one reason that people tend to be so resistant to the information, because they're conditioned to be. Another reason is because many vegans, like many people, have never learned the tools to communicate effectively. We just don't learn them. I talked about this in the video you showed earlier. And so even if you've learned how to communicate effectively, it's hard. But if you haven't learned that and you have this incredible sense of urgency, which is totally understandable around the message and around the issue, and you're trying to speak about that, that makes it even harder for your message to be heard. So, and this is, again, one of the big issues, I think, in the movement that is so critical for vegans to really learn how to communicate effectively, and particularly about this issue, veganism, effectively. Our Center for Effective Vegan Advocacy gives trainings on this. I know you guys do as well. And then, of course, during COVID, in some ways, it's even harder because for many people, they're feeling incredibly destabilized right now. They're feeling very insecure, and people, when they feel frightened and insecure and out of control, they tend to cling what's familiar and what's comfortable. It's like, in some ways, talking about veganism right now, I think that the conversation is starting to open up so we can start talking about it. But when you talk about something like veganism with somebody who's feeling incredibly destabilized and insecure, it's like talking about politics with a drowning person. Like, they just don't want to hear anything. They just want to get their head above water.
Yeah. Yeah. That's so relevant right now. Let's see. So related, communication can be really combative online, on social media. And I think, around the current pandemic, people like to police each other as well as just in general, right? We know that people communicate differently online than they might in person. So do you have any tips, related to relational literacy that can foster better communication and better relationships with non-vegans over social media and online?
Yeah, I mean, fundamental to relational literacy is effective communication. I mean, communication is the primary way that we relate. So, when we communicate in a way that is relational, meaning that fosters a sense of connection, rather than disconnection. When we communicate in a way that's relational, we communicate by practicing integrity, asking ourselves, what is respectful here, practicing compassion and justice and honoring the dignity of others. This doesn't, and I don't mean to oversimplify, that's just the foundation, right? And then there are a lot of very practical ways to do this. So, one of the things that's really important to remember with communication, relational dynamics in general, but let's talk about communications. Every communication has two parts. It has the process and the content. The content is what we're talking about, and the process is how we're communicating. We tend to over focus on the content. We tend to like load on the facts, and try to be right and prove that we're right. When in fact, the process matters more. So if you think of a conversation that you had, say like a week ago, or maybe a year ago, you might have forgotten entirely what was talked about, but chances are you actually remember how you felt in that conversation. That's because you remember the process. The process determines how you feel. When our process is healthy, we can talk about anything without arguing. And when our process is not healthy, we can't talk about anything without arguing. So in a healthy process, our goal is mutual understanding. That's it. We use communication for one reason and one reason only. And that's because we're not telepathic. Our goal is mutual understanding. It's for you to understand my thoughts and feelings and for me to understand your thoughts and feelings. Our goal is not to win, which means to make the other person wrong. It's not to lose. It's not to be right, which means to make the other person wrong. It's to share the truth of our experience and hear the truth of the other person's experience. And ideally, what we do is we share our observations. This is talked about to some degree in nonviolent communication. Effective communication is about identifying what you observe. So for example, I observed that you yelled at me, you yelled at me. Our perceptions of what we observe, I don't want to say you yelled at me, that actually could be a perception, but let's say you honked your horn at me in the road and then you cut your car in front of me, blocking me from getting to the light. That's what I observed. My perception is that you were, not taking my feelings into account. Mm-hmm. And I feel really offended by that. So we communicate what we observe, what we perceive, and what we feel. And separating these three things is really, really important, because a lot of the time we get so upset because we're creating a story about something that happened. We say this person in the car was just a jerk. They're just selfish. They don't care about anybody else. This meat eater is just apathetic, however we want to put it. Right. We create a story when in fact that person might have been rushing to the hospital, when in fact that meat eater may never have actually been exposed to information that really broke through their defenses, or, maybe they're terrified of, losing important connections in their family if they go vegan, who knows? So in both of my books, Beyond Beliefs and Getting Relationships Right, I have a chapter on principles and tools of effective communication and like very specific strategies. And I wrote these books because I feel so strongly that it is, for many people in the world and for vegans, which is, where my work is focused, learning these principles and tools are game changers. I mean, most of us know what it feels like to be screaming into a vacuum, mm-hmm. saying the same thing 30 different ways, and still it doesn't get through. And like this siphons so much energy out of a movement that needs all the help it can get. And we end up being much less effective ambassadors for a cause.
Well, yeah, we have a question like this. And I'm thinking about what you said about the content versus the process. So often we're so focused as vegan activists on saying, this is the information, it's right here, like look at this video, this is true, you have to see it. And people will say, no, I get it. And someone says here, on what basis do they get it if they then don't do it? So if you say, I have friends who say, I totally get that being vegan is the right thing, it's just I'm not going to do it. And so how that can be so hard. Why do you think that? Can you talk a little bit about why that happens to help us understand?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the more vegans can appreciate the psychology of change, of changing behaviors, of changing habits, and psychology in general, in particular, the psychology of oppressive social systems like carnism that really deeply condition people to become addicted to the very behaviors that are like destroying the planet and harming them at the same time. The more we can appreciate this, the less frustrated we'll be, and the more effective we'll be in our advocacy, communicating about the issue. People people do what they do for good reasons to themselves. There are many people who are not ready to become vegan in the world. They're not, it's just too hard for them for whatever reason. It may seem silly to vegans. They say, well, oh my God, you're putting, your fear of being ostracized from your family, which is actually the case for many people. They're afraid that if they go vegan, they become a member of this ideological minority group. Their family is going to reject them. Here's yet another thing that makes you a different weirdo in our family, or, whatever. For many vegans, they say, well, so what? I mean, you're putting your fear of marginalization, let's just put it, of being ostracized over somebody else's life and death and torture. Like, how do you compare? Human psyche doesn't work that way. Most people do not make that profound connection with the animals and what's really happening until they feel safe enough to make that connection. And to feel safe enough to make that connection, they have to feel safe enough to give up whatever it is in their lives that they might have to give up when they make this change. Maybe it's simply having faith in humanity. It is hard. You become vegan, you wake up to the fact that you're living in the midst of a global atrocity, and your life is never, ever the same. You need to be ready to withstand the pressure of that and what meaning that has for you in your life. So, people become vegan and they lose important relationships in their lives. It's very important to recognize that people will cling to their way of being for a variety of reasons. Generally, it's because they don't feel safe enough to change on some level, and we can't force people to be ready to change. And if we judge people for not changing, we're only going to reinforce their resistance to our message. It can be helpful for vegans to think about the things, think about things in your own life that maybe you should give up, but you just can't. It's just too hard. And I'll give you an example, for me. I had a person years ago when I was still living in the US, when I was living in Boston, and I lived directly across the street from a Whole Foods. And this person was a fruitarian, and they were very passionate about fruitarianism. And they said to me, Melanie, you really should be a fruitarian. It is, with everything you do in your life, you're so interested in living ethically and the environment, health, all of these things. Fruitarianism is like, the way. And they made a really good case, to be honest. They really did. And, talked to me for a long time. And I said, look, I hear you. And what you're saying, from what I hear, makes rational sense. I still would have to do more research, but it made rational enough sense. I said, I just can't be fruitarian. And they said, what do you mean you can't be? Of course you can. You live across from Whole Foods. I said, I know, but I feel like I would just be missing out. And they said, well, you get used to it. It's just a different way of eating. And I said, well, I travel a lot. Well, you could travel and find a way to do it. I travel and find a way to do it. And I said, well, but winter comes and I want warm food in the winter. My body needs it. It craves it. No, your body's just used to it. It was all the same arguments that vegans use. And in the end, I just said, it's not possible. And they said, but it is possible. And I felt very defensive. And I thought, you're making yourself an expert on what's possible for me. And so this is exactly what we do as vegans. We look at somebody's life and we say, it's possible for you because it's possible for me. But we cannot be the expert on anybody else's experience. As soon as we do that, we are not respecting them. And we're probably putting them off, and other people know what is possible and what is sustainable for themselves. So this is why I always recommend that when we're talking about veganism, we ask others to be as vegan as possible. We don't say, go vegan. We say, why don't you just be as vegan as possible? Because nobody can be more vegan than what's possible. And this reduces defensiveness tremendously. And it also helps us become less frustrated with people who say it's not possible.
Mm. Well, related to this, we have a question from someone who says, I always struggle between calling myself plant-based or vegan. I usually just consider my audience, but from growing a movement perspective and expressing the ethical considerations of veganism, how would you recommend I manage this?
It's a great question. And I don't know the answer. I mean, I would say answer with whatever you feel like most honestly reflects you and your values. I don't think it matters that much, to be honest. I think it's it's an important conversation for us to continue having. I tailor my description of myself to my audience. So if I'm talking to people who are, consider themselves plant-based, I'll use plant-based more. But I do feel it's important to normalize the word vegan and to create, positive associations with the word vegan. So I make sure that I try to, even in those conversations, I bring it in.
We have another question about how do you feel about relating animal exploitation to other injustices?
So this is tricky. I have a book called Powerarchy, Understanding the Principle, what is it called? Understanding the Psychology of Oppression for Social Transformation. And in my book, Powerarchy, I talk about the psychology of oppression and the interconnectedness of oppressions and how really important it is for us to recognize this interconnectedness. However, how we talk about the interconnectedness matters. Typically, when people relate or compare animal exploitation or oppression to other forms of oppression, they do it from the perspective of the victims. And this can create a lot of defensiveness. I always talk about how it's important for us to see oppressions as interconnected because the mentality that enables oppression is the same, regardless as to who is being oppressed. So when we focus on the mentality of oppression and the way that systems of oppression, carnism, speciesism, sexism, classism, racism, these all have the same structure, then it becomes a productive conversation because people don't feel like we're trying to say one set of victims suffers more than another, or that the suffering of each set of victims is somehow the same.
This is a bit of a personal question for you, but maybe an illustrative one. So do you have any close friends in your life that don't follow a plant-based or vegan diet? And if so, how do you maintain your friendship? And I'm sure it's through empathy and all sorts of other tools that you've explained.
Yeah, I do. I mean, I have people in my family, for example, and a couple of friends too, who are not vegan and who I'm very close to. And it's not an issue for me at all. And it doesn't even cross my mind when I'm spending time with them, because I don't see veganism as the be all end all. I think it is fundamentally important. I think, I don't see veganism as the solution to the world's problems. I do believe that no solution without veganism will ever be complete. But I don't think of myself as primarily a vegan. I think of myself as a person who is motivated to practice my integrity, my compassion, my values of compassion and justice. And this gets expressed in various ways. And veganism is one of those ways. But I also recognize that, like everybody, I live with contradictions. I'm not a perfect person. And there are certain things that in my life, certain ways that I live that I hope I evolve out of. So I live in Europe now. I don't drive that much anymore. I almost never drive. But when I was in Boston, I drove a lot. And I drove even when I didn't need to, because I hated the cold. I just hated the cold so much. And it's not so cold where I am here now in Germany and Berlin. So that's kind of relieved me. And it's very bike friendly. So it's relieved me of that pressure. But I only changed my driving behavior, which I knew was problematic, when it became easy enough for me to do so. And that was just one contradiction I had to live with myself and be compassionate toward myself around. And with my non-vegan friends and family, I feel the same way. People make the choices they do for reasons that matter to them. If people are treating you with respect, if people respect you and they honor you and they're interested in who you are and they respect your veganism, then that's a gift, because the world needs a lot more respect in its interpersonal interactions. So if I have people in my life who respect who I am, and who are respectful of my veganism, even when they're not vegan, then there's no barrier to me to being able to feel very connected with them and consider them close.
Yeah, amen to that. And when you talk about the need for, it was easier for you in Berlin to not drive as much. I think that's why our movement needs so many different facets. We need to learn how to effectively communicate, but then we also have people who are working to make vegan food more widely available, more cost effective, more tasty. Yeah. Yeah.
Yep, exactly.
Great. We still have some questions coming in, so if you don't mind to stick around for a little
Sure
bit.
thing.
Okay, great. So let's see. Well, here's a question. So you've talked a bit about several of your books, and someone asked, do you have books, resources, support groups, something else to support the animal advocate like me, who's struggling to communicate and wants to do so effectively? So you've talked about. Can you maybe give us some of those resources that you have either from yourself or others?
Yeah, sure. So we have established the Center for Effective Vegan Advocacy, CEVA, whose goal is to do just this, to really support vegans, advocates and people who, vegans, to be more sustainable and more effective in their advocacy. You can go to veganadvocacy.org. That website's being overhauled. We're going to have a lot more resources coming up soon, but we have resources there. We have a video series. We give trainings on effective communication and other forms of effective advocacy, including sustainability, how to avoid burnout. My book, Beyond Beliefs, is written for vegans who want to learn how to navigate relationships with non-vegans and more effectively. And my book, Getting Relationships Right, is really, this is a book you could actually give to people in your life who are not interested at all in veganism, but might be interested in, managing their teams better or their own relationships better. And hopefully, based on the principles in that book, it will help them cultivate greater empathy and sensitivity towards social injustices as well. And both of those books, Beyond Beliefs and Getting Relationships Right, they are the result of a deep dive that I did into the literature on healthy relating and effective communication. And they should provide a lot of tools.
Yeah, and I would highly recommend these books, not just for us as vegan activists, but in our marriages, in our family relationships, really thinking about empathy and integrity and how we use those is really key. So I thank you for those resources.
Thank you.
So this is a question someone's asked a couple of times. I find it easy as an activist to lose hope in humanity. How do you remain positive?
Well, for one thing, it's important not to over-witness. Over-witnessing is when you are taking in too much information about suffering in the world, essentially. Like, it's really important, especially for those of us who are called to do this work. Like, we tend to be more sensitive people in the first place. So we tend to be more sensitive to violence and suffering. And then we end up inundating ourselves. So one reason that people become misanthropic, there are many reasons for this, but one key reason that happens in our movement and beyond is because we end up becoming traumatized from witnessing so much of the traumatic imagery and the traumatic reality that we have opened our eyes up to. So, I see vegan after vegan after vegan, they come to our workshops and they're, just having such a hard time, and they keep watching these videos. I ask them, like, why are you doing this? And they say, well, I feel guilty. I feel like if I stop watching, I'll stop caring, or I'll lose my motivation to keep doing the work, And just because you stop taking in information, traumatic information, does not mean you're going to lose your empathy. It means you will lose the trauma, hopefully, that might be driving some of the way that you're doing your work. So, or they'll say, I feel guilty because compared to what the animals go through, why can't I? The least I can do is watch them for 2 minutes suffering. The animals don't need a movement of walking trauma survivors. They need a movement of healthy, resilient, self-connected people who can come to this work from a place of presence and groundedness and be in it for the long haul. So one key way to help build your sense of, faith in humanity, or however we want to say it, is to not inundate yourself. Give yourself permission to stop witnessing if that's what you're doing. There is, at veganadvocacy.org, we have a video you can watch on sustainable activism, where I talk about trauma and the traumatization that affects vegans. You don't even have to be an activist. And I have a checklist where you can look and see, if this may be what is affecting you and your sense of misanthropy. This is also, I have a chapter in Beyond Beliefs that's also specifically on traumatization that might be helpful. So if you are feeling misanthropic, there are other reasons, obviously, that could be contributing, but it is definitely an indicator to learn. All vegans, anyway, should learn about secondary traumatic stress, which is the trauma that comes from being aware of and witnessing violence. And you may also want to, reflect on the balance in your life of life affirming experiences to violent experiences. If you don't have enough life affirming experiences, positive connection with animals, for example, positive connections in your life with humans, healthy relational connections really help keep us resilient and positive. If you don't have enough of that to offset that heavy awareness that you carry with you, you're probably going to start to feel misanthropic and even, perhaps depressed.
So here's a question. I'm a 4-year vegan, passionate about outreach and activism, and college student, and the president of her veg club at her university. And she thought that she would find other young people be more open to this issue. And instead, she's finding that really tough for people to not mock it and brush it off. How do I get my board members to have at least half the amount of zest that I have for this issue? I feel like I'm always dragging everyone along and I can't get events going without a team.
Board members of a vegan club, they're already vegan?
Let's see. It's a veg club, so maybe they're not all vegan. But in general, I guess she's just feeling like they're not being zealous enough. So maybe they are already vegan. They're just not as zealous activists as she is.
Mm-hmm. So not be as inspired. It really depends on why they might not be inspired. And so that would be a really good conversation to have and just ask and name it. I'm a huge believer in authentic conversations. And maybe you've already asked this, but it would be really great to, I think, probably good information for you if you sat down and said, I feel like, I'm wondering if this is a great way to start a conversation that might be difficult. I'm wondering if you're not feeling as inspired about our activities as you could be. And I really want everybody to feel inspired. So I'm curious about, how you are feeling in terms of your inspiration. I want you to be happy. This is in the best interest of them too. What do you think might be getting in the way of it? And what might help you to feel more inspired? Ask them, because the lack of inspiration can be from a lot of different things.
We have this question. Humans function by out of sight, out of mind. How do you balance that with telling people not to over witness and seeing so many vegans lose that urgency? Do you think that's an issue?
Personally, I haven't seen vegans who stop over witnessing and stop being active. Generally, what I see is that when people, there's witnessing and then there's over witnessing. If you're already aware of what's happening and you already are motivated to be a part of the change, then you don't need to take in, you don't need to witness. When you're witnessing, or I should say witness graphic imagery, when you do that, you're feeding your sense of traumatization, and then you're coming to your activism from a place of trauma, and that is dangerous and often very counterproductive. So I have not seen this be a problem. Vegans suddenly saying, okay, I'm no longer watching these videos, so I'm going to throw up my hands and stop caring. And if 1 or 2 vegans or even a small handful of vegans actually ends up doing that, I think the price that we're paying of vegans, hundreds, thousands of vegans who are quite traumatized and coming to their activism from a place of moral, not just healthy moral outrage, but contemptuous moral outrage, is much more counterproductive and much more concerning to me.
Yeah, and I wonder, you talk about building resilience. I wonder if instead going, making sure you go to a sanctuary and volunteer and seeing cows and goats and in the flesh and seeing that they are empathic beings and reminding yourself of that.
That's a great suggestion, right? So you can feed your motivation. If you feel less motivated, you can feed it by going places where you're having these positive connections with animals.
Let's see. We have somebody asked, do you have any tips on how to develop and practice relational literacy? Of course, that's really what we've been talking about this whole time.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, the good news is that if anybody who wants to do this can, like, it's not rocket science. The information is out there. So the reason, if you're really interested in developing relational literacy, this was the reason I wrote Getting Relationships Right. I feel so strongly that building relational literacy is fundamental to all of the most important changes we need to see in the world, because the most pressing problems facing the world today are problems that result from the same common cause, which is relational dysfunction. So Getting Relationships Right, I wrote, was a total labor of love. It was not a book I wanted to write, but I felt so strongly that there had to be something out there that was really like a one-stop guide to relational literacy, you know, that had everything in it that I felt like was essential to having the big picture and also enough practical tools. So yeah, I mean, that's what I would recommend, because that was the whole purpose of putting that book together.
You mentioned that you think veganism is a piece of the solution to the world's problems. Do you think there's a chance that one day the world will become vegan? Do you think that's something we could see in our lifetime?
I don't know when we'll see it. I mean, I didn't expect in my lifetime for the movement to be as advanced as it is. I'm pleasantly surprised that it really is mushrooming all over the world. It's really quite incredible to witness. I feel quite convinced that veganism will replace carnism as the dominant ideology. In my mind, it's not whether, it's really when. And I'm saying this based on watching the trajectory of the vegan movement, you know, evolve, and how it's following the trajectory of other social justice movements. It's following in the same kind of direction. Why We Love Dogs, Eat Pigs, and Wear Cows is coming out. It's in the 10th anniversary edition is coming out August 1st. And it's really exciting. It's got a foreword by Yuval Harari. And we are so excited to be launching the book right now for this very reason, because the world, my publisher and I are quite clear that the world is ready for this conversation. It's already being had in a completely different way than it was 10 years ago. You know, it's really helped me reflect on the past 10 years and how much has changed.
Oh, that's so exciting.
It's
We look
really
forward to
exciting.
that. Yeah. So maybe this is a good question for us to kind of wrap up and close on. Someone asks, why are family members the hardest to talk to? And maybe we can expand this to, you know, those who are closest to us. It can be so hard. Yeah.
There are a number of reasons for that. I mean, one reason is that there are existing power struggles, right? So it's not like you're starting from a clean slate. Existing power struggles can get in the way. This can be just like one more conversation where it seems like there's a competition of needs and one person's going to be right and the other person's going to be wrong. So that's one reason. And that's an important reason. Another reason is because, you know, as I said earlier, there are a lot of people. I mean, there are like over 8 billion people in the world today, unfortunately, you know, and a lot of those people are just not ready to hear this conversation. They're too psychologically and or practically invested in maintaining their carnism for a gazillion reasons. But a lot of people actually are ready. Those are the low-hanging fruits that we need to really reach out to as advocates if we want to be effective. Just because somebody is in our family, this does not mean that they should or would be in more of a state of readiness than somebody else. There's no, you know, so you could walk into a room of 100 people, non-vegans, and, you know, maybe 30 of them are open to and receptive toward veganism, and 70 are not. And of those 70, you know, some of them may be your own family members. They just happen to be those people. So this is one of the reasons I say also that it's just important to ask your family members, you know, or the people close to you, to be a vegan ally rather than to go vegan, to be a vegan ally, because everybody has a right to expect that their inner world is known and respected. If there's any degree of closeness in their relationship, we have a right to ask that. Asking somebody to go vegan puts us in kind of an advocacy role, and that often doesn't go over well with family members.
And so just related to that, I'm going to slip in one more, because this is almost like a family. Someone asked, it's very common to see attacks among our own community, within our own movement, people attacking each other. And because activists adopt different strategies to solve the problem, everyone feels that their own strategy is good. How can activists have the capacity to be more empathic and strengthened?
This is another reason that I feel that relational literacy is so fundamentally important. If we were more relationally literate as a movement, if we had, our collective level of relational literacy in the world is incredibly low. Like, we are still living in what I would call the relational dark ages. And in the movement, it's not terribly different. Our collective level of relational literacy is quite low, and it's not our fault. We just haven't learned this, but we end up engaging in very problematic dynamics with each other, especially when you throw into the movement, you throw into the mix the fact that many of us have been traumatized from seeing what we've been seeing. We're already being bullied by the dominant carnistic culture. We can tend toward moral perfectionism when we suffer from trauma, and when we feel that sense of urgency to transform this global atrocity or trauma that is carnism. It's a very complicated mix. The antidote, of course, is relational literacy, because that means developing self-awareness. It means developing an understanding of how we feel so that we can manage our emotions, attend to our own needs, and develop an increasingly mature capacity to stay in connection with others, even when we have differences of opinion.
Yep, absolutely. Well, thank you so much, Melanie. We are at about 1 hour now, so
Okay.
I appreciate your time so much,
Thank
and
you.
for being here for us and for the movement. Your work
Thank
is so
you.
important, and I really thank you for it.
Well, thank you. And thank everybody for tuning in today, and, just wanting to be having these conversations that I think are so important for all of us.
Yes.
It's been a pleasure.
Oh, excellent. Well, we will compile some of the resources that you listed and make sure to post them. This video will be available to be shared. So we hope that those of you who were here today live will share it. And
Great.
thanks again, Dr. Melanie Joy.
Thank you.
Okay.
Bye.
Bye-bye. Take care.